All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, I have a really special treat. I have Donald Robertson with me, calling in from Athens, Greece. I'm really excited to have a conversation with him. A quick intro of Donald. He is a psychotherapist and author of The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, and most recently, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Donald has also been working on a graphic novel called Verissimus, the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. His new project will be the main focus of today. He's also one of the founding members of modern Stoicism and runs the annual Stoic Week events, as well as the International Stoicon conferences. Donald holds dual master's degrees in mental philosophy and psychoanalytic studies. In addition, he has postgraduate diplomas in cognitive behavioral therapy as well as psychotherapy. So, Donald, it's always a pleasure to see you. Always a pleasure to see you, to interact with you, to see you on Facebook, all the places that we come to contact together. And a quick intro of me, if you don't know, my name is Bob Cymber. I'm a philosopher and entrepreneur, educator, and published poet and short story writer. And about 6 months ago, I created Stoic Coach, which is a personal life coaching platform that utilizes Stoicism as the foundation for 5 distinct tracks: resilience, life planning, habit breaking, self love, and interpersonal training. I've been practicing Stoicism for almost 9 years now, and I hold an undergraduate degree in philosophy and a master's in teaching, as well as a diploma in interdisciplinary studies. So that's us. We'll go ahead and get into the conversation. And Donald, just kind of getting starting off the bat, you're calling in from Athens. Just what is it like being in a city that is kind of the epicenter of Western philosophy? Give us a little overview of how that feels.
Well, I love Athens. It's cool. It's interesting. It's inspiring. Um, and like there's lots of aspects of it that are good to explore. I love the Greek people and the culture, so it's nice to be here. It encourages me to think about philosophy and it's inspiring.
Great, yeah, and I saw that you posted on Instagram a few days ago that you were in the front of the statue of Athena
Mm.
doing some reflecting. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's just down the road, like that's where I go for a walk every day. But I'm pretty close to the Acropolis and the city centre and the Agora and stuff as well. Like sometimes if I'm feeling a little bit more ambitious, I might walk to into the city centre. I go to Plato's Academy. It's not too far from where I live, actually. Sometimes I'll go there for a walk. It's like about a 30, 40-minute walk down there. And I'll walk around the grounds of the academy. And everywhere you go, you can see the Acropolis, which reminds me of Stoicism, because one of the main techniques and ideas in Stoicism modern scholars call the view from above. And it struck me a long time ago that the view from above is literally the view that ancient authors had if they went to a lot of high up places with which they were familiar, like the Acropolis, for example. And then I noticed that actually in the Greek, I don't know why I hadn't noticed this before, but in the Greek of the Meditations, Marcus says that we should look down upon events as if from high above. And he talks about looking down on agoras. And it sounds like he's describing the Athenian agora, but then in another passage where he's talking about the mind becoming free from passions, he describes it as being fortified like an unassailable Acropolis. So he actually refers to the Acropolis and the agora when he's describing Stoic apatheia and the view from above. And so I think of that whenever I see the Acropolis.
That's beautiful, and I'm sure it adds a lot to your reflection of doing the view from above and all those exercises as well. So, very neat, very neat. So, obviously, if the audience doesn't know you, you use Stoicism as a tool for conducting therapeutic training as a psychotherapist, which is always an added benefit when talking to philosophers. And why do you think that Stoicism in particular has such a great fit for people seeking therapy?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Number one is that, as it happens, Stoicism is the philosophical inspiration for cognitive behavioral therapy. So the pioneers of cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly Albert Ellis, who developed this thing called rational emotive behavior therapy in the 1950s. They quoted Epictetus. It's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them, in order to explain what we now call the cognitive theory of emotion. So Ellis would give that quotation from Epictetus to all of his students and all of his clients in therapy, as far as I can tell. Certainly, he quotes it very often. He talks about teaching it to people a lot. And there was a time, anyway, when I would have thought every cognitive behavioral therapist would be very familiar with that quote from Epictetus. Maybe not now, but certainly there was a time when everybody knew it, and it was quoted in virtually all books on CBT. So there's this kind of fundamental premise that cognitive therapy and Stoicism have in common. So anyone coming for CBT, which is a lot of people nowadays, is going to recognize it. It has an affinity with Stoicism, but Stoicism also gives clients something which to some extent is difficult to deliver in therapy, which is something that is much bigger. It's an entire philosophy of life. Certainly in conventional clinical CBT, it would be kind of beyond the bounds of what could be accomplished in those sort of sessions. So they're kind of more limited in scope. So clients will often say what attracts them to Stoicism is that it's broader in scope, it's deeper than CBT. It's not just a treatment, it's an entire worldview, a set of moral values, and a philosophy of life. And especially when people benefit from CBT and reach the end of it, they often want to know, surely there must be a way that you could apply these ideas to the whole of your life. And traditional CBT clinically doesn't attempt to do that in any way. It just kind of stops there. It gives the client some techniques for maintaining improvement, but it doesn't say, oh, and by the way, you could turn this into an entire worldview if you wanted to. So that tends to, particularly people that benefit from therapy, will often look towards Stoicism as a way of continuing it. But also Stoicism, the reason that researchers are particularly interested in it is that it holds out a lot of hope for what we now call resilience training, which would be, to be clear, therapy is remedial in nature, as the name implies. So when people have therapy, they already have a diagnosis, generally speaking. Whereas the holy grail of mental health would be prevention. Prevention is better than cure. And so we call preventative training resilience training, emotional resilience training. And a lot of people think that Stoicism holds out a particular hope as being a form of resilience training.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, great insight there. Thanks, Donald, for that. And in talking about resilience, you talk a little bit about it in your recently published book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And has the reception of that book provided you with a kind of optimism that modern people are finally ready to get back to the classics, to get back to Stoic thought? Has it provided you with any sort of boost or encouragement with that thought?
Yeah, I mean, Stoicism goes through kind of cycles in its history. It started to grow in popularity from roughly the 1960s onwards because of the connection with cognitive therapy, but slowly it grew. And then when I first started to get involved with Stoicism, it was about 25 years ago now. It makes me feel kind of old when I say it, but it was a while back. And really there weren't this, and also this makes me sound like a kind of hipster saying I was into this band before they were cool or whatever, but there weren't many books on Stoicism. There were only really a couple. There weren't really many popular books on Stoicism. I think William Irvine's book that kind of came out around about that time, A Guide to the Good Life. But that was about it, really. And there weren't big Stoicism communities and stuff like that there are now online. There wasn't an annual conference like there is now. And people said to me, why would you bother studying this subject? It's kind of a really obscure niche thing to get into. But it wasn't long before Stoicism suddenly became popular. And for a number of reasons, loads and loads and loads of books started to come out. Some quite popular books. Ryan Holiday's books became very popular. And then celebrities like Derren Brown, people like Tim Ferriss, began kind of mentioning being interested in Stoicism. And Stoicism started to become a very popular subject for people to cover in podcasts, blog articles, and in the media. Stoic Week was covered by virtually every newspaper in the UK when we started doing it. It's been covered by lots of like well-known magazines, like we did the thing that was in Forbes, for example, been in The Economist and stuff like that. So I've been on the BBC World Service talking about Stoicism. Like it became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when I brought out How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, that was like my sixth book, I think. And yeah, like it did. I think it did. Maybe my publisher will correct me about this. I think it did roughly twice as well as they expected.
Oh, nice.
And it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and it got to #1 in the industry sales figures for philosophy when it came out. And it's been translated subsequently into 7 other languages, and it's going to be translated in due course into another 6 languages. We just sold the rights for Japanese edition of it, and the audiobook did really well as well. So like the book did better than we thought, and it still continues to do quite well. And then the pandemic happened. And I remember also, I've got a good memory for these things. I remember people saying, oh, we're a bit worried that people are going to stop reading books because of this pandemic in the publishing industry. And then the opposite happened. Like, I don't know whether people during lockdown suddenly all decided to listen to audiobooks or something happened, but classics have become more popular in general since the pandemic. And books on Stoicism, based on the actual industry sales figures, have gone through the roof. Like, particularly the actual classics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, like a lot more people are reading now. And then there's other things coming out. There's a sequel to Gladiator coming out. John Malkovich has made a movie about Seneca. You know, so Stoicism, I think we still have not reached peak Stoicism. Like, it's still, we thought we had, like a few years ago, we thought maybe this is it, right? It's grown and it'll get this big and then it'll kind of like plateau out. But the pandemic made it, give it another kind of big thrust of popularity, and it just continues to grow and grow.
Great. Yeah, it's really exciting to see where it takes us, and it'll definitely, hopefully, obviously, it'll be good for, you know, people who practice Stoicism, but also for people who are curious about it and kind of getting the word out. So hopefully that does continue to grow, and we see that influence our communities more and our societies more. So I guess we'll get into the meat of the conversation, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this. Also, is for your new project, you are working on a new graphic novel called Verissimus: The Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. And in this project, you've worked really closely with Portuguese illustrator Zenuno Fraga. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right. Fraga.
Fraga, I think.
Fraga.
Zenuno Fraga. He told me the other day that Americans all pronounce his name Z, but in Portuguese it's pronounced Zé, I think.
Gotcha. Well, hopefully he can reach out to us and correct us if that's incorrect. And for those who have not read your blog on your website about the project, which is really informative, what is the history behind the title of this graphic novel?
Well, it's Marcus Aurelius' name. Like, it's a kind of cognomen he had that people don't mention much these days, but we can infer that it was well known. There's a couple of pieces of evidence that suggest it was quite well known during his life. So the Historia Augusta tells us that Hadrian gave Marcus Aurelius this name. So it's a play on words. Marcus's family name is Verus, which means true, and Verissimus means truest or most true. And so Hadrian, apparently, and it's annoying because we don't know why Hadrian. So it's kind of frustrating if you're a historian or biographer, because we don't know why Hadrian did this. But Marcus said or did something as a kid that made the Emperor Hadrian go, "Geez, I'm not going to call you true anymore. I'm going to call you the truest." Like, it's an odd thing to do, and so it must have been well known because it survives in Historia Augusta. It's also in the Historia Romana of Cassius Dio. And then there's other kind of fragmentary references to it. Herodian mentions the name, but says it was a name that Marcus gave to one of his sons. But one of the most interesting examples, so he was given this nickname. It's kind of implied that it was when he was quite a young child that Hadrian gave him this name, but we don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly what it was that prompted it. But Justin Martyr, in the first apology, which is written to the Emperor Antoninus Pius, addresses Marcus Aurelius as Verissimus the philosopher. And so incidentally, some people go, well, did people know Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher? Some academic wrote an article recently questioning whether Marcus Aurelius is really a Stoic. And actually, I just think that's ridiculous, because I think it's crystal clear from the ancient sources that Marcus was very, very well known during his lifetime as being a Stoic philosopher. So, Justin Martyr refers to him as Verissimus the philosopher, for example, and then goes on to bang on to him about Stoicism, incidentally. So it's clear that he knows what sort of philosopher he is. But it looks like everybody knew that he had this name. Also appears on a medallion and some coins as well, if I remember rightly. And the other thing I'd say about it is, this isn't surprising for a Stoic, but in the Meditations, Marcus talks a lot about truth and honesty as kind of virtues that he's particularly interested in. So it seems that this was kind of a title that he was happy to try to live up to. It seems to imply honesty or truthfulness. I'll kind of come back to that later, because it's really a bit of an enigma historically, because Hadrian was... people paint Hadrian sometimes in quite a positive light, and he did do many great things, and he was a very intelligent man, but he was also, towards the end of his life, a despotic ruler, a tyrant. He had political purges, and he was hated by the Senate. They wanted to refuse him deification, this traditional honor, after he died, and to annul his acts, because they thought he was a brutal, tyrannical dictator, that he kind of got a bit crazy towards the end. And Hadrian was, a sophist, basically. Like, he wanted to be a sophist, and he's not someone that you would associate with the virtue of truthfulness. But there's another odd piece of evidence that puzzles historians. That I think it's in Historia Augusta. It says that Hadrian was good friends with the philosopher Epictetus, which seems really unlikely. I cannot imagine. I'd love to be a fly in the wall, because I can't imagine Epictetus having a conversation with Hadrian. Hadrian did visit Greece. He probably could have encountered Epictetus, but Epictetus kind of spoke to truth to power and stuff like that, and he's very
oh yes.
And Hadrian didn't really like that. Hadrian would persecute and destroy the careers of, and potentially exile intellectuals that he didn't really like. There's a story that illustrates this quite nicely. It's like the fairy tale, or the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. That's what I think of when I think of Hadrian. I think of the Emperor's New Clothes. So Hadrian was trying to be like a sophist, and he was giving some sort of pretentious speech. And one of his favorite sophists, this guy who was into skeptical academic philosophy, called Favorinus of Arelata, a philosopher from Gaul, a sophist from Gaul. I know it's like Roman Empire, it's kind of cosmopolitan and weird. So this guy, who's really into Greek philosophy, who comes from Gaul, is in Rome. That's like me being Scottish but a Canadian citizen and talking to you from Athens. It's like, it gets a bit disorientating after a while. The Roman Empire is like that. So this guy was listening to Hadrian declaiming, and Hadrian got a word wrong, or was arguing about a word or something. And one of Favorinus' students said to him, "Master, shouldn't you correct the emperor? He got that word wrong." And Favorinus said, "Well, you should excuse me if I permit the man who commands 30 legions to be correct," and which is a shocking example of intellectual cowardice, right? So he's basically saying, "Yeah, I'm not going to risk it, thanks. Just let him believe he's right. I don't have the courage to tell him that he didn't even get the word right." And so it's very tantalizing, right? So bear that in mind, that we're told that story And yet, this little kid, Hadrian went, I'm going to call you the most truthful. You're the most truthful person at court. I would love to know what that little kid said to him.
Yeah, yeah, it'd be really fascinating, like you said, to be a fly on the wall in some of those scenarios. Yeah, yeah. So getting into that, as Marcus Aurelius kind of, goes through childhood, in the book, in the graphic novel, what do you think are some benefits of showing the story of Marcus Aurelius through the medium of pictures? And I'll go ahead and show those while you talk. I'll go ahead and cycle
Yeah.
through a couple of those pictures for us. And why do you think? What's the benefit? Because again, we've in your career, you focused on just text, and now you're going to pictures.
Yeah.
What's the benefit?
Well, I kind of stumbled into it. We got into it by accident, and I was just kind of invited by a publisher to do this. And I thought, I guess it'll change my perspective. I've studied Marcus Aurelius for such a long time and in such an amount of detail that I thought, after a while, you kind of think there's no big surprises out there. There's no big, revelations that I'm going to discover. I've gone over and over and over all of the historical sources, like all the many modern biographies that exist on that. So I think, I kind of know most of the details now. And I thought maybe my perspective will change when we visualize it as artwork, but I'm not really sure how. And so I was kind of curious to see how that would affect things. So first of all, there's something that I would say about the way the reader experiences the meditations. So this is a paradox. Book one of the meditations is full of historical detail because it's a list of all his friends, his tutors, and family members and their virtues. So it's brimming with these kind of character sketches, like of 17 different people. And so it's actually very valuable to historians, although in a sense a little bit frustrating because he tells us about the character of these people, but then doesn't tell us, specific things that they did. He kind of vaguely alludes to things. He says that his father, adoptive father Antoninus, demonstrated real character in the way that he forgave a customs officer in Tusculum. And you think, but what happened? What did this guy do? So you were kind of, it's left artfully vague. But then throughout the rest of the meditations, it is incredibly artfully vague. He seldom mentions any specific events. I'll give you a clear illustration of that. Probably one of the most famous and widely quoted passages in Meditations is the beginning of Book 2. So that's the beginning of Meditations proper. Book 1 is kind of like a preface, and it may have been written at a later date. So Book 2 is where the main part of the book begins. And the first passage says, every morning when you arise, tell yourself you'll meet meddling, treacherous, deceitful people, and so on. And you think, well, that's interesting. And some people read that and they think, that sounds like my mother-in-law. Or they think, it sounds like that guy that works at the desk across from me, like in the other office or whatever. So we naturally project ourselves into it because it's vague. He doesn't name any names, right? He doesn't say anything specific, strangely. And throughout the rest of the book, with a few exceptions, it's pretty much artfully vague. I've scoured that book looking for historical details, and you can tease out a few little bits and pieces, but most of it is similarly vague. And so in a way, that's an asset, and it helps explain why the book's so popular, because people project themselves into what he's saying. So it's good that it's kind of almost anyone could have written that book, right? You wouldn't necessarily know that it was written by a Roman emperor, or if you didn't have some of the context, you could have thought anyone could have written this stuff. Because he doesn't mention specific examples or details very often. And even when he does mention a lot of people's names, but it's often left kind of abstract or vague. He doesn't talk much about his relationship with them. So if we then imagine him, the context in which he was writing and saying these things, we kind of lose the ability to project ourselves into it, but we gain. So sometimes people say, well, how would I apply this stuff in practice? And I think we learn more about that if we can see how Marcus applied it in practice. So a really easy example would be that there are loads of things in the Meditations about contemplating death and our relationship with death. So we can justifiably imagine that if Marcus spent decades, 4 decades, rehearsing these ways of thinking, that he was probably still saying similar things when he was dying, when he was lying in bed for a week or so, dying of the Antonine Plague. And so if we visualize that scene and imagine his internal dialogue was similar to the stuff that he says in the meditations, which just seems like a reasonable inference, then it kind of takes on, it becomes more concrete. We can imagine Marcus applying it to something very vivid, and it becomes more grave, more serious, more real. Suddenly it gets real. And I think then that potentially allows us, in some ways, to think in more concrete terms about how we'd apply it in life ourselves. I'll give you another example. Marcus talks. Oh, actually, the passage in book 1 where he says every morning when you get up, you imagine deceitful people he mentions. Well, Marcus was betrayed. He might be talking about his wife telling him some little white lie or something. But, the Marcomannic War, the Romans called the conspiracy, because all these client states that were meant to be allies of the Roman Empire conspired against them. And then when they saw the Romans were dying of plague, there was a huge invasion, maybe possibly tens, possibly even hundreds of thousands of allied barbarian tribesmen invading the northern provinces, crossing the Alps and all the way down into Italy. And so if you imagine that happening and Marcus in the middle of it, saying every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to meet treacherous people. He's talking about world historic events, history shaping events. He faced a civil war. So again, for him to say every morning when you wake up, imagine that you're going to meet meddlesome and treacherous people. And if you imagine him saying that to himself as he wakes up and he's being told that one of his generals is declared himself emperor and is instigating a civil war, it's suddenly on a much grander and more concrete scale. He's not kind of dabbling, he's dealing with life or death issues. Commodus was at Rome, incidentally, when that happened, and Commodus would have been 14, and Marcus was in Serbia, and so Commodus was rushed to the military camp because the Romans were frightened, possibly 50-50, that Avidius Cassius was going to march on Rome, in which case Commodus would have, been rightfully worried that he would have been beheaded. This 14-year-old kid, Marcus's son, is like, whoa, I need to get out of here. I'm going to be the first for the chop. And in Rome, you're also always being circled by potential assassins. I think a quarter of Roman emperors were assassinated. And so one of the things about it is you realize, to put it glibly, I imagine every day Marcus Aurelius was one of these guys that opened his eyes and kind of, pinched himself and thought, am I still alive? And when we visualize it, that really hit home. So in the history books, we read, there was an Antonine Plague. Maybe it was smallpox. It killed roughly 5 million people. Some whole towns were completely depopulated, blah, blah, blah. That's interesting. And then you turn the page. But if you visualize it in a graphic novel, you realize, no, that goes on for nearly 15 years. And he has to live in the middle of it. And then there's a war. And then there's a civil war in the middle of it. And his senior officers are dropping dead of the plague in the middle of having to deal with these wars and stuff. And he wakes up every morning and he must be thinking, in Rome, we've got no real idea how this thing works. So, at any minute I could drop dead. And so the sense that you just have to kind of trust the gods, because there's not much that you can do to protect yourself. And my friends, my family are all dying. And I could die any minute, or they lost the equivalent of a whole legion. And some in the Battle of Carnuntum, the 20,000 Roman soldiers they lost. And so Marcus in the northern frontier, he stationed himself on the frontier at the front line. He must also have thought it's possible that I could be killed by the enemy at any point. He tells us that he goes into the lands of the Quadi in the Meditations. One little specific detail, tantalizingly, he says in the rubric, written among the Quadi by the River Gran. Now that's on the other side of the frontier, right? That's across the Danube in enemy territory. And the Quadi were this client state that rebelled against the Romans and took part in the war. So what if Marcus was there? He wasn't in a proper legionary camp. He might have been probably in a temporary camp. He could have died. He could have been murdered in his sleep by the enemy.
Yeah.
It's quite possible. Or people died of disease. They were assassinated. Marcus's co-emperor and his adopted brother Lucius Verus dropped dead in the middle of the First Marcomannic War. Apparently from plague. So I think the thing that comes home is the fragility of Marcus Aurelius's existence, and the numerous things which could have killed him at any point. And there are things that emerge that make us view it differently. But the meditation suddenly, I think, becomes a lot more serious. You realize, no, he's really having to use this to cope with this kind of meat grinder situation that he finds himself. Such an extreme situation that he literally must have had to be grateful every day that he was still alive. And I think, by the way, Roman society was surprised that Marcus, I think, was still alive. I think they generally assumed he's going to peg it at any minute, because he was notoriously unhealthy. One of the later emperors actually describes him as having translucent skin, because they perceived him as being so pallid, and he had chronic chest and stomach pain. He had problems speaking in public in Austria because he said the cold air, it was hard for him to use his voice. He had to really project your voice to address the Praetorian Guard, whatever. And he had a couple of episodes of illness where they thought he was maybe going to die, but he recovered. The death is much more imminent for him than we might assume, and details like that emerge a lot more. But it made me study the history in a far more detail, because obviously when you're writing a book, there's bits that you can leave out, right? I don't have to describe what a Roman villa looks like, or what a Roman cavalry officer, what type of sword he would be using, or what did Sarmatians eat, what does a fortress in Syria look like? I don't know. But when you're doing the graphic novel, you think, oh man, we're gonna have to draw that. So we're gonna have to do all this research and try and figure out what would a siege of an ancient Parthian city look like. So I'm very lucky. We have a whole team of people. I normally prefer to work on my own, but we've got Zé, the illustrator, but I also have a guy who's an expert in military history, Roman history, that's advising us on historical authenticity. And I have a comic book editor called Casey Pierce, who helps us edit it from the point of view of comics. Incidentally, Casey's specialism is horror, and it wasn't until I started writing this book.
Oh, really?
That I realised that a lot of it, I was reading it. I think my editor's still not entirely convinced of this, but I was reading it and I thought, some of this is a horror story, right? This is horror we're writing. I didn't know that it was, and then I read it, and so it makes me smile when people say, "Oh, you're writing a graphic novel. That's great. I'll be able to give it. I'm going to give it to my kids for Christmas."
Yeah.
Right. So well, you could do, but I mean, there's quite a lot of nudity, crucifixion, beheadings and stuff in it, right? And there's pretty hardcore. We've got a scene in the graveyard where Fronto's talking to Marcus about how he really resents the fact that one of his grandchildren has died, and he's kind of wrestling with the injustice of it, and there's a lot about racism in it, and Marcus is kind of debating with him the Stoic theory of providence, and how it relates to Stoic ethics and stuff like that. It gets pretty hardcore in terms of the philosophy and the implications of it. So, and the geopolitics as well. A big part of Marcus's life story is about how he treated immigrants and foreigners. And he spoiler alert, he was kind of more lenient. He was more of a military dove And I think the main reason for the Civil War was that other senators and generals just thought, certainly Historia Augusta really strongly implies that they also at one point explicitly states that Avidius Cassius, the guy that instigated the Civil War, just wanted to use more force against the Germans in summations. And they give us some examples of what he meant by that. Like in one instance, he tied a lot of Sarmatians to a huge wooden pole, they tell us was 20 foot high, and presumably on top of a hill, and then set fire to them so that all of the neighbouring camps of the Sarmatians could watch these guys burn alive, because Cassius clearly, from other things that we know, thought that the way to control these people was by making them really scared of Rome. Sometimes they would just, if they were getting lazy, they would just round up a load of captured enemy, chain them together, take them out in a barge into the middle of the Danube and kick them in to drown. So that was what those guys wanted to do. And Marcus didn't want to do that. Like, he was more interested in negotiation. He was a master diplomat. And, they thought, this is too expensive and it's taking too long. Can't we just have this kind of scorched earth policy? Where we could, what's wrong with genocide? Why couldn't we just go and kill them all and be done with it? And, then if you read the Meditations in that context, Marcus only refers to being a Roman citizen, I think twice in the Meditations in passing. But on every page, he talks about justice, brotherhood of man, philostorgia, natural affection for others, and social virtue in general. But he's always talking about other human beings, not his Roman citizens or subjects. And again, if you imagine him actually saying that while he's negotiating and meeting with tribal chieftains that he's at war with, I think it really does change the meaning of some of those passages, and because it raises very profound questions about Roman foreign policy, and his politics as emperor, because he doesn't see it as us versus them, and he sees it much more that he has a duty not only to Roman citizens, but he also has a duty to even to the enemy under natural law, is to treat them ethically and appropriately. So we also hear that Marcus caused a lot of turmoil by resettling thousands of captured enemy within Italy and within the provinces, whereas other Roman generals would just have auctioned them as slaves or killed them.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I think, kind of going into the next question, you talked about it because it's really interesting, and I didn't really think about this, Donald, is that you have been kind of a lone wolf in doing your work by yourself for a long time with your previous books and your work, and now you have the challenge of working with a team. And a follow-up for that is, apart from sort of working with a team and getting all these fine details of all the events, like you said, describing villas and all the pictorial accuracy that goes into it, are there any other challenges of showing the life and story of Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius through pictures, through images?
Well, there's things I'll tell you, that are maybe interesting to mention. When I wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, so like some of the people that reviewed it initially, I think less so now actually, but a couple of initial reviews where people were saying, well, you've made up all these stories about Marcus Aurelius and this is a work of fiction and stuff like that, right? And it took me a while to realize they listened to the audiobook. And because they listened to the audiobook, they didn't see how many footnotes there were containing references to the Roman histories and other sources, right? So the stories in Roman Emperor aren't made up. Like, they're embellished slightly. Like, for example, we'll insert dialogue and things, but they're based very closely on the surviving Roman histories. So it's not an attempt to present a bipartisan picture of history. If you're doing a real biography, you kind of have to say, well, this could have happened, but that could have happened, and the texts contradict each other, or this bit's a bit ambiguous. Whereas for Roman Emperor, we had to say, no, we have to come down on one side or the other in order to create a narrative. And the same, by the way, goes for a graphic novel. You cannot do a graphic novel and say, well, we think this happened, but another author contradicts it. Like, so if you're going to depict it as a narrative, like a movie, you have to pick an interpretation and follow it through to its logical conclusion. So this is one version of what the Roman histories actually say. But one of the things I keep saying to people is, the bits that people find most surprising are the bits that are just lifted directly out of the Roman histories, right? So, the bits that we embellished, or kind of the gaps that we filled in, are not the bits that anyone ever questions. They're just filling over little cracks and things. So there's one scene in it where Lucius Verus is digging a canal in Syria, and they uncover a fossilized dinosaur. And so even when my editor saw that, he was like, "What? You can't have dinosaurs?" And we're like, "No, it's a thing. It's in two different historical sources, right?" They phrase it a bit differently. They say he found a gigantic skeleton. They thought it was a skeleton of a river god, but they say it was encased in stone, and they found it when he was digging a canal in Syria. And we know that Augustus apparently had a room filled with gigantic bones that they discovered when they were digging. So it's, the Romans don't have a word for dinosaur, obviously. So they just say we found gigantic bones and we didn't know what animal they were from, and we found things encased in stone at the bottom of a canal and things like that. So sounds like they're finding what quite probably or quite feasibly could be the fossilized remains of some kind of dinosaur. So there's bits in it like that I think people will think that didn't happen, and then they can go and look at the footnotes and check out what the ancient sources say. One thing I'd say about it as well is that we have to take a relatively uncritical. So sometimes people say, well, you're drawing a lot in the Historia Augusta, and that's an notoriously unreliable source, right? So what I would say in response to that is twofold. Close scholarship on the Historia Augusta has basically supports the claim that the chapters about Marcus Aurelius are the most reliable parts of the whole book. So there are bits of it that are unreliable, and then there's bits of it that are more reliable, and there are reasons why that would be, because the guy that wrote it is drawing on earlier sources. So in the chapters of Marcus Aurelius, he's drawing on an earlier Roman historian for most of it, which is relatively reliable as a source. And that's the first part. And then the other part is just, if we're going to tell a story, we can't really critique the sources that much. If we're going to make a movie or write a graphic novel, it's a similar kind of process. To some extent, you have to take the historical sources at face value and go, we're just going to tell you what they said, right? They might not be accurate, but this is to the best of our knowledge, this is what they tell us happened. Unless we get a time machine or something and go back, we can't. It's difficult to check for sure whether they've kind of distorted events a little bit. Because a lot of Roman history is full of propaganda. It's obviously biased and things. That said, I'll happily make a historical case to anyone. There are some people that think the Historia Augusta is unfair to Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius' brother, but I'm not convinced by that. It might overstate the argument against him, but I think there are other indications that suggest that he was not a quite different character from Marcus Aurelius anyway. The experience of writing it meant that I had to adopt a different attitude towards history. And I'll tell you another weird thing about the process is when I started doing this, obviously it normally takes a year. You get a year in publishing to write a book, generally speaking. But the graphic novel takes probably at least 2 years. This is a 250-page full color graphic novel, so it's a lot of work. So as an author, that makes me kind of agitated. Because I think, well, we've been doing this for a year, isn't it? Time to do something else now. It seems like a long time. And so I spoke to my publisher and said, can't I just write another book at the same time? Like, well, the illustrator's coloring it, for example, I don't have to do that much. Like, I could just write another book. And they said, well, that doesn't normally happen. But by chance, I was offered another book, and so by another publisher. So I'm now in parallel writing a biography, a more conventional biography of Marcus Aurelius for the Ancient Lives series for Yale University Press. So the graphic novel is coming out from Macmillan, and then this biography is coming out from Yale. And I think the main reason I'm allowed to do that is because the two books complement one another. So both publishers are like, well, we might sell more of each book if they kind of come out around about the same time. Otherwise, normally you're locked into a contract with a publisher, and they would just say, no, we're not going to let you go off and work for somebody else. So I'm in a slightly unusual position of working on two books about the same subject at the same time. It's kind of weird. What's really annoying about it is that sometimes I'll be doing this really, I have to do pretty in-depth and I have to do kind of unusual research for the biography. And so sometimes I'll be researching it and I'll think, we should have put that in the graphic novel, but it's too late now. So the biography, there are, I should mention also a very basic point. To go back to what I said earlier about people thinking, the story's all just made up or something. A lot of people don't realize how much we know about Marcus Aurelius. So we know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do about most other philosophers. And we know far more about Marcus Aurelius than we do about any other Stoic philosopher. So Zeno was the first Stoic, and Marcus Aurelius was virtually the last famous Stoic of antiquity. And yet we know far, far more about him than we do about any of the other Stoics. And that's for the simple reason that he's what I would technically refer to as a big deal back in the day. So because he was a Roman emperor, there's archaeological evidence, there's evidence from coins and medallions and inscriptions, and there are surviving histories of his reign and some of his private correspondence as well. So we know a lot of information about Marcus, and there are many modern biographies of Marcus Aurelius, like Anthony Burley, who just passed away recently, wrote the best one, and then Frank McLean's got a very popular biography of Marcus Aurelius, but there are a whole bunch of other ones as well, actually. So there's loads of information about the life of Marcus Aurelius, but for some reason people who are interested in Stoicism often don't realize that. And they just read the Meditations and don't know that we know so much about his character.
Right.
And then sometimes they'll say, well, maybe we don't need to know anything about his character in order I could just read the Meditations. And I don't know. I mean, that's down to the individual's preference. But my experience has been that most people get twice as much out of the Meditations if they know more about the cultural, philosophical, and historical context in which it was written. Because like I said, there's a lot of things that are kind of hard to really understand unless for instance, in book 1, when he talks about all those people, if you don't know who any of those people are, then that kind of limits how much you can learn about the things that he's saying. If you know more about who they are, then you'll be able to understand more about what he meant when he was saying some of those things. And there's a couple I'll tell you, this is kind of maybe going off to one side a little bit, but there's something I want to mention, because I didn't realize this until recently. So sometimes if you look very, very closely at sometimes if you're studying a historical subject, occasionally you'll discover new information, and then you go, boom, this is almost every historian's dream. But that rarely happens in a case like this. Most of what we know about Marcus Aurelius, we've known for a long time, and it's been trawled over repeatedly, right? And so usually what you hope for is just spotting a connection, like among all of this information that people have been passing for a long, decades or centuries. So one example of the former actually is there's some debate about when Marcus wrote the Meditations and when he was stationed at Carnuntum in Austria. Incidentally, I went to Carnuntum to do the research for this and from other books. And so I spent a week there, and I interviewed the head of the CEO of the Carnuntum Archaeological Park, Marcus Wachter, and I interviewed the head of archaeological research at the Carnuntum Museum as well. So we did a lot of background research like looking at the reconstruction of a 2nd century villa that they have there, and looking at the landscape and everything. So yeah, like what was I going to say about some of the historical details? So I mean, this is a kind of nerdy bit of trivia, but so from the ancient sources, it's kind of a little bit unclear where Marcus was when, but the archaeologists found a stele, a gravestone. They dug up a gravestone that's from the inscription is dedicated to a Praetorian legionary, so a member of the emperor's personal legion, his personal bodyguard, and it's dated 171 AD, right? So we can be 99% certain that Marcus must have been in Carnuntum in 171 AD, because one of his personal bodyguards dropped dead there, right, and was buried there. Like, and normally they would be accompanying the emperor. So some authors have said they thought Marcus didn't actually arrive there until the following year. But so now we found this thing in the ground that suggests no, he was there in 171. Like, there's the marker that dates it. It's quite satisfying when you find stuff like that. But I guess another thing I'd say that probably comes through to some extent in the graphic novel, the biography I'm writing at the moment. So because there are many biographies of Marcus, I had to pitch an idea that was different. And I said, listen, I think I can write a biography of Marcus Aurelius that is different from the existing biographies, because it would focus more on his personal relationships with key people in his life. And it would focus a lot more, and I don't know why the other biographies don't do this more. Frank McLean particularly doesn't really seem to like Stoicism, incidentally, that much. And so many people comment that his biography doesn't really talk about how Stoicism influenced Marcus's life. So the historians sometimes aren't interested in the philosophy, which seems quite odd. Right? It'd be like writing the biography of a famous Christian bishop, but not like mentioning anything about Christianity. Like, Marcus was 100% a Stoic. He was famous for being a Stoic, and Stoicism influences his moral values and the decisions that he made as emperor. So the two things are inseparable, right? And it's surprising that more biographies separate them. So I wanted to write in a way where I really look closely at the meditations and how it actually relates to the decisions and he made as emperor, and vice versa, really. So the first chapter, at the moment anyway, really focuses on Marcus's relationship with his mother, because his father died when he was about 3 or 4 years old, and so he was mainly brought up by his mother, and she's quite an interesting woman, Domitia Lucilla, and we can't be sure, but I think it's possible. I'm kind of 50-50 on this at the moment. It's possible that it was Marcus's mother that kind of set the stage for him becoming a Stoic by probably choosing his tutors. And the choice of Stoic tutors is kind of idiosyncratic. Like, he should have been studying mainly rhetoric, and he did to some extent, but then he changed to kind of major in Stoicism, as it were. So it may be that his mother was into Stoicism and decided that she wanted her son to study this. There are certainly things about her that really clash with the culture of elite Romans during the period. She's a highly intelligent, highly educated woman. She's a Hellenophile. She loves Greek culture. But Marcus says she's unlike other wealthy Romans. She lives a much more simple lifestyle. So I think he saw her in some ways as exemplifying certain aspects of Stoicism, and she maybe kind of steered him towards these men that were, in a way, substitute father figures for him, who gave him a philosophy of life, that he was lacking. I think Marcus lost his father and was looking for a male role model, and I think ultimately, instead of an individual man, his philosophy became his role model, his guide to life. He found something abstract, in a sense. He found a body of literature and a set of doctrines that acted as a substitute father figure for him. Like, Stoicism became his father, to put it figuratively. But one of the other things I'd like to say about Marcus is When people often talk about Hadrian as being one of the good emperors, and I mentioned already that Hadrian kind of lost his mind a bit and became quite violent towards the end. Well, Marcus was growing up during that period, and he saw all of that. And Hadrian had spies everywhere. And I think it's, to be honest, I think it's virtually certain that throughout pretty much his entire childhood, Marcus is, would have been potentially surrounded by spies and informers, and that certainly that would have been something that he must have been cautious about. Also, the Historia Augusta says something slightly creepy about that. It describes Marcus as being reared under the eye of Hadrian, which, if you bear in mind that Hadrian had a whole network of secret police, and he paid informers all over the place to grass up, particularly his friends. In particular, the closer you were to the seat of power, the more Hadrian would be spying on you. And Marcus was a front runner for the throne. So I think it's pretty clear that Hadrian would have been tempted to spy on him, and probably did. This thing then about him being called the most true is interesting. Because most people around Hadrian were very careful what they said, even in their own households, because the freedmen and the slaves in their household could inform against them. Like, they would be paid lots of money by the emperor for, And then Marcus went to live in Hadrian's villa for about 6 months when he was preparing him to succeed. Well, given how bad it was, the climate in Rome anyway, to actually have to live in Hadrian's massive villa and be surrounded by all of Hadrian's staff, you'd have to be extremely careful about anything you said, because you could be pretty sure it would all get back to Hadrian. His slaves and his freedmen, of course, they're going to grass you up, as we say today, and inform against you. So Marcus, at one point in the Meditations, as you may know, says something. Marcus often says things that sound like they're influenced by Cynic philosophy. So there's one passage in particular where he says, "Never do anything that requires walls or curtains," which sounds like something Diogenes the Cynic might have said, right? And it's also kind of amusing, it's hyperbole. But geez, if you then imagine him saying that after having spent his entire childhood growing up surrounded by informers, a state apparatus that uses hundreds of secret police everywhere, and political purges where people are exiled or executed. Marcus's family members were persecuted by Hadrian. There's an extremely tense atmosphere. And then later in life, he writes, "Never do anything that requires walls or curtains." Yeah, sure, because someone might see you doing it. Like, they might be peeking through a hole in the wall or something, then go tell the emperor, and you get beheaded. So it really places a much more intense and slightly sinister kind of tone. Imagine how much it would shape you as a child if you lost your father at 3 years old, and then you grew up in this climate where your family members were being executed, exiled, and you're friends of your family by this crazy emperor, and then he invites you to come and live in his villa. You're I don't know, how old was he at that point? I think he was probably about 15-ish or something, 16 maybe. It'd be stressful, to say the least, and it would shape your character. So that I think there's this theme that runs through the Meditations about Marcus focusing on his interior life. I mean, it's almost stating the obvious. The book itself, the Meditations, is somebody who's incredibly focused on transforming his inner life, as many people are today. But a lot of people aren't like that. A lot of people are more extroverted, and they're more concerned with external appearances and their behavior. But Marcus says his mother taught him not only to avoid wrong actions, but not even to consider doing wrong things, to actually transform his innermost thoughts and feelings. And I think this is related to the idea that even in private, you're still being observed. And you can never be sure whether you're being watched or not. So this must have affected him psychologically. And we see in adult life, Stoicism becomes a very good, a very healthy thing for Marcus. But for sure, it's a reflection of the unusual childhood that he had, I think.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting that when you were talking about the, kind of developing the graphic novel itself, you said that you kind of wrote the story and then you kind of gave it away to the illustrators and the team to do the rest of the work. And I remember, Donald, that you made a post and you mentioned that there was a best-selling graphic novelist that said that his book took about 6 or 7 years. And so that's
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting to see that you're like, no, we can get it done sooner. Has it been a kind of the process of that? Has it been kind of, you've been kind of calling them and been like, hey guys, what's going on? How's that been going with communication with the whole thing?
Yeah, I speak to the illustrator every day. Like,
Where's it? What's
we
going
have,
on, man?
I think, we're pretty organized. So yeah, like you can do a graphic novel quicker. I mean, it makes a big difference what it looks like. If it's black and white, then it's much faster. But ours is full color and it's also quite long. It's 250 pages. So the script is written, but the script kind of gets revised a bit along the way as well. So, and I have a lot of input actually on the artwork. Well, to some extent, like I'll review the drafts, then I'll review the color pages, and often there'll be like small changes, hopefully at that point, that I make. And then we have a team of people, like I said. So we have two editors really, and we have our editor, our publisher, and then we have a freelance editor. We've also got a guy that advising in historical accuracy, and we have a couple of other people as well that give feedback that sometimes we'll adapt things based on what they're saying. So it's quite a complicated process, and we're doing it in a fairly timely manner. Those guys, it took 6 or 7 years. I suspect that was done in a quite kind of leisurely way, because that is a long time. And by the way, in publishing, the amount of money that you would be paid to do something wouldn't account for. I mean, you might make a lot of money if it's a bestseller, but you wouldn't normally kind of bank on living for 6 or 7 years on the advance for a book. Like the assumption more is in terms of a year. So you're kind of stretching things a little bit if you take that long to finish the work. Also, they had 4 people in their main team, which is like, we have people that are advising us as consultants and stuff like that. But like, if you have lots of people working on a book, then you have to divide the income from it. And if it's a thing that takes a lot of time, you've got to pay everybody. So these are some of the factors that you have to juggle in terms of making the whole project actually work, and making it financially viable, and making it all come together. But we had to be pretty organized and pretty structured about it. And I'm lucky that the people that I'm working with are pretty on the ball and good at what they do.
Donald, I'm really excited, and it's just fascinating, the wealth of information that you bring to the table, and I'm very grateful for your time. And I guess kind of getting to the close of the interview, and I'm really excited for what you say here. I'm really excited to see what you think about this question. And to close, what is the most profound or astounding thing that you've discovered in your work with Stoicism?
What's the most profound thing that I've discovered in my work with Stoicism? Gosh, I mean, it's hard to answer that, because there are so many aspects to Stoicism, and pretty much all of it is quite profound, and some aspects of it are shared with other philosophical traditions. Like a lot of what the Stoics say is very profound, but it comes from Socrates and other philosophical sources as well. So it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer. And then I could also give a banal answer, and I could say it's the cognitive theory of emotion. So that's really the central thing, and it's central to modern cognitive therapy. But I feel that's a bit of a cliched answer, right? And if I was to give a more personal answer, I would say I really think that what the Stoics say about death. I wrote an article about that a couple of days ago, actually. And I've always been very interested in the contemplation of death. I studied philosophy at university, you mentioned earlier, and the university I went to it was unusual because we studied Wittgenstein and Heidegger at undergraduate level, whereas those are normally left more to postgrad students. But we had two guys that were experts. And Professor Gorner at Aberdeen was an expert on Heidegger. And a big theme in Heidegger is being towards death. It's very similar to the Milite Thanatou and the Socratic tradition. So I was kind of like steeped in this existential tradition before I even got into Stoicism, about the contemplation of our own mortality and the implications that has for our values and our perception of things. And Heidegger doesn't really make these connections explicit. I don't know if he even consciously knew about them or not. And he certainly was very familiar with the classics, but he's a little bit opaque about what his sources are sometimes. I think the most profound thing is the Stoic idea that really just grasping the brute fact of our own mortality, it's kind of like the challenge of life in a way, is that we are, because of the way life works, we're almost inevitably bound to be indoctrinated into this worldview that the Cynics and Stoics call tuphos, which means smoke or mist. Like we would say today, smoke and mirrors, right? So they talk about being surrounded by this tuphos of human opinion, like we're surrounded by this illusion that consists in all the value judgments that society makes, the consumerism, the celebrity culture, the hedonism, the narcissism, the egotism of society. That's tuphos, that's the smoke and mirrors that surrounds us. And how the hell do we get out of it? Like, it's not as easy as just picking up the Meditations and reading it, because it's the water in which we swim. To mix metaphors, it's like everywhere you go, you turn on the TV, you speak to everyone you interact with. It's embedded in the very language that we use to think, talk, communicate. Like we're entangled in this web of false philosophy that we inherit from society, that makes it out that external things are all important in life, and it sets us up for neurosis, and it harms our character and gets us into ethical pickles. And the Cynics and Stoics thought we need to snap out of this somehow, and it's going to require pretty strong medicine to get us out of this thing that we're so deeply entangled in. And the strongest medicine they knew was the confrontation with our own mortality. And they said potentially, not always, but potentially the combination of philosophy and really coming to terms, because they, as everyone knows, when you're looking death in the eye, we've all heard this a million times, but it doesn't necessarily sink in unless you're in that situation. When you're looking death in the eye, you suddenly think, I don't know if I really needed to spend that much time on Facebook, or I don't know if it was really important to win that argument with that guy, or I don't know, like was it really that big a deal to get that promotion at work? Like, all the things that you spend your life chasing after, suddenly you think, yeah, half that stuff is kind of pointless, really. Like, it's sort of trivial, right? You realize it's all BS, right? And Diogenes realized that. He knew it. Like, and the early Stoics kind of saw through the tuphos. Like, but sometimes it's only bereavement or the threat of death, like, or something like that, that's powerful enough to really shake us out of it. As Heidegger said, this is what Heidegger calls existential anxiety. Like he said, all the network of associations that we develop and our values, the whole way we perceive the world, suddenly becomes fragile when we confront our own mortality. Because we start to think, yeah, we were just kind of going along with what everyone else was saying, and then suddenly you kind of think, yeah, but maybe that was all BS, right? And it gives you the freedom. As the Stoics like to say, particularly Epictetus, it's all about really figuring out how to liberate yourself morally and psychologically. And that freedom comes to some extent through this existential crisis and, being forced into a situation where you start to see through the web of lies, like see through all the kind of stuff that the TV and the newspapers and other people want to tell you is like a really big deal. And to realize, I'd say I'd add to that, a couple of times people said to me, how would you define wisdom? And I like to bounce ideas off my little girl, right? She's 9 now. But one day I thought, I think it's very important to, like Socrates would have said as well, maybe one of the simplest things we can take from ancient philosophy is just talking about the word wisdom and what it means is important. Like people don't talk about it much. Like what does wisdom actually mean? And she asked me, she said, Daddy, what is wisdom? And I thought, can I define wisdom in a way that would make sense to like a 7-year-old or whatever she was at the time? And I said, well, wisdom is when you really know what the most important things are in life. And there's something that goes hand in hand with that, which is realizing that a lot of the things that other people say are important aren't actually that important. And if somebody really understands that, then I think, that's kind of more or less wisdom. And she seemed to understand that. She was like, oh, yeah, I kind of get what you mean. Like, that seems like it would be important. And the Stoics formally define wisdom as knowing being able to distinguish between good, bad, and indifferent things. So the formal definition of it is pretty much along those lines anyway. So I think the confrontation with death, where we suddenly go, maybe all that stuff didn't really matter, like looking back on it, that allows us to radically recalibrate our values and think maybe liberating ourselves and gaining wisdom is more important than I thought, and maybe kind of like impressing people and earning lots of money and stuff like is less important than I thought. Maybe it's not really important at all. Maybe these external things are actually indifferent and neutral, and what matters is the use that you make of them. Maybe some people make better use of poverty or persecution, and maybe other people use acclaim and wealth badly. But the Stoics and the Cynics said it's almost like they call it an epistrophe, like turning everything upside down, doing a U-turn. Like they thought I think a lot of people today don't realize that. They think of Stoicism as just this kind of like cool way of coping with stress or something. No, the Stoics are suggesting something, as Musonius Rufus and Epictetus say, that should make you pee your pants. They're suggesting something radical and shocking and dramatic. Like they're challenging the prevailing values of Western society at an absolutely fundamental level. They symbolized that by the Cynic philosophers used to walk backwards through the Ceramicus. And when everyone was coming out of the theatre, the Cynics would walk into the flow of the crowd. And someone said to Diogenes, why do you do that? And Diogenes says, this is what I've been doing throughout my entire life, is swimming against the stream and walking in the opposite direction from everybody else. It takes strength and shamelessness, like, to be willing to kind of strike out on your own path like that. That's what I think is most profound about the Socratic, Cynic, Stoic tradition in general. Like, could you say Stoicism? That it really strikes at the heart of things and presents this radical challenge to us. Really, that's a deep existential question that it confronts us with.
Awesome. Well, guys, there you have it. Donald Robertson talking about his thoughts on Stoicism on his new project. And Donald, the new graphic novel will be out, you said early first quarter 2021 around?
I think probably not the end. I would think probably towards the end of the year.
No, toward the end of 2021 or okay. So guys, feel free to look out for it. I'm sure you'll see it all on the social media. It'll be on the Facebook group. If you haven't joined Donald Robertson's group on Facebook, it's a really great place for getting updates on all the stuff, the projects that he's working on. So definitely recommend joining that. And Donald, thank you so much for being on. I know your time is very valuable, especially talking with the graphic novel going on with the illustrator and working with the team, because that's what the project is all about. So Donald, thank you so much, and I hope to definitely talk again soon and update us about all the good stuff that's been going on with the new biography that's coming out.
Cool. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me along.
Definitely. So, all right.